My name is Jennifer Barron-Prawl. I am the project manager for the Southwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, and I'm so pleased to be your host for this webinar today. Today's presentation is titled Developing and Supporting the Boundaries You Need and is facilitated by Siri Gilman. This is actually the fifth presentation of a series of workshops that Siri has been conducting over the past several weeks. So again, welcome to folks who are new to her series, and welcome back to folks who have been to the past presentations that she's had. So as you all know, folks who have seen Siri, she's amazing. We really appreciate you all joining us today, and we truly hope that you find today's presentation engaging and helpful in your work. All right, just to start off with some housekeeping items, we've made every attempt to make today's presentation secure. If for some reason we need to end the presentation unexpectedly, we'll follow up with you using your registration information. All attendees are in listen-only mode and cannot share video. If you have a question for Siri, we ask that you submit it through our Q&A pod. I'll actually be monitoring that pod, and we'll do the best to respond to as many of those questions as time allows at the end of Siri's presentation. If you have a comment or want to share a resource with all the attendees, be sure to use your chat box. Betsy is monitoring that chat box for us today. So be sure to respond with all your responses on there. Make sure that you get that to all attendees and not just to all panelists. So you can see there's a little drop-down arrow. So if you want everyone to see your responses, be sure then to do that little drop-down to respond to everybody, because we want everyone to see your responses. Today's event is closed captioned, and you can press the CC button on Zoom to access this resource. Also important, this particular session is being recorded. This recording, as well as the slide deck, will be available and posted on our MHTTC website by Monday. You'll receive also an email at the end of by mid next week regarding a CEU certificate of attendance. Be sure when you look mid next week to check your spam folder as well as your inbox so that you can get that information. And then lastly, we will have a brief survey at the end of this event, so it'd be wonderful if you could complete that for us. As I mentioned before, this particular webcast is being sponsored by our Southwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. Looking at this map, you'll see that there are MHTTC regions all over the country. And again, this particular event is being hosted by a Southwest team, so right here in purple. The purpose of our MHTTC is to develop and strengthen the specialized behavioral health care and primary health care workforce that provides mental health prevention, treatment, and recovery support services. Our goal ultimately is to help people and organizations to be able to incorporate effective practices into mental health services. So after this presentation, be sure to take a little minute and visit our website. You can actually find your center if you're in a different part of the map here, and see what types of trainings and resources are offered in your particular region. This presentation that we're doing today was prepared for the MHTTC network under a cooperative agreement from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration, also known as SAMHSA. So the opinions that are expressed in the presentation are the views of our speaker and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services. Whew, so exciting. So why don't we go ahead and get started? Oh, I'm glad about this. So I want to introduce you to Siri Gilman. Siri is a licensed marriage and family therapist and author. She teaches Overwhelm recovery and healthcare and human services providers. Siri is a prolific writer and has published 3 books. She's the author of The Mystery of Knowing Journal, the Journal for Self-Care and Boundaries, Transform Your Boundaries, and Naming and Taming Overwhelm for Healthcare and Human Services Providers. Siri ran nonprofit organizations for 20 years. 2 of the organizations serve children and teens who are homeless. She's the founder of Cocoon House in Everett, Washington. She taught leadership development for 7 years, and she's been in practice for 35 years and continues in private practice within her community on Whidbey Island in Washington. So with that, I'm very pleased then to introduce you to Siri and have her kick off then for today's presentation. So Siri, the floor is all yours.
Good morning. Well, morning here, but I realize we are gathered from all around the world. And thank you for joining in for today's topic on, let me share my screen so we can all continue. Let's see, just take a moment here. Okay, here we are. Today's topic is on trauma and secondary trauma, caring for yourself and others. So, if you missed our last webinar, it was on boundaries, and we did an hour webinar on boundaries, and I have lots of material on boundaries that I teach on that also includes some self-care, which we did in our earlier webinars. So if you want to dive deeper and need more, you can use the code Texas on my website, and you can get a 20% discount for the deeper dive into some of this work, because I know for some of you, I received emails that you really want to go deeper. I also want to share that this is the last webinar in our series, but that they are all recorded, and that Jennifer and Betsy can let you know how to reach those recordings. So if you want to go back, you can go back to them. And our final session is next Friday morning, and it is a discussion group about what we covered today. So if we don't get enough time for your questions or your thoughts that you want to share, please jump on that next Friday, because I would love to have a deeper conversation about this topic in particular. So I'd like to remind everyone to allow yourself to open and to close as you need to. Whenever we talk about trauma, a lot comes up for people. Many of us have been through a lot in the pandemic. Some of you are tuned in from Texas, and you have permission to take care of you. And this is really important for those of us that work in the field of trauma, to be able to always self-monitor and recognize when we're at capacity, when we feel too full, and when we need to step back. So if you need to step away from the computer and you just feel like it's too difficult of a subject for you at this moment in time, that's okay. It's being recorded. You could come back to it when you feel able to. I'm not expecting the material itself to be traumatizing this morning. I'm very careful when I teach on this subject to not traumatize the audience with stories that are traumatizing on purpose. And I try to use images in my PowerPoints that are soothing and calming throughout the presentation, and that is very intentional. So I want to start by talking about Claude Monet. He's one of my favorite artists. And this is a picture from Giverny, and it has his weeping willow with the water lilies in the background. And the weeping willow is a symbol for him of grief that he used during World War I when he was painting some of these. He did paint water lilies throughout most of his life, but in the last 20 years of his life, he did this whole series, and they're gigantic if you haven't seen them in person. I've driven many miles to see these paintings. I've flown a few miles to see these paintings. I'm very moved by them. I did not know that he started some of the large panel parts of the series when his second wife died, and then his son died, and then we had World War II. And so he was in quite a state of grief and loss as he was painting these. And Now that I know that, as I look at the paintings, I have a different feeling when I look at them. And I want to encourage you to recognize that when you need to express your own feelings through trauma or secondary trauma, to use all mediums. Sometimes words um, are harder to express yourself with, and maybe using paint or clay or some other way to put your feeling out there, and help see what you're feeling and acknowledge what you're feeling, to allow yourself to just use all mediums. I'll never see his water lilies the same way. So today's agenda is we're going to talk about caring for yourself and others who are experiencing trauma, recognize what puts you at risk of secondary trauma, learn the difference between overwhelm with trauma and without. Overwhelm recovery is one of the subjects that I talk about and write about, and that was in our first webinar. Understand how to listen for trauma through the intensity of overwhelm and tend to your grief, and identify the supports that you need for yourself in trauma and secondary trauma. And we're going to go deeper into what kind of supports you'll need in the discussion group for next Friday. So today we might be going over that part a little lightly. So, there's a lot that has been written about trauma. There's a lot of interesting material out there. And what I'm sharing with you today is really my own experience of working with trauma for 35 years and being what I consider a student of trauma. I really believe that trauma is my teacher. And I have been studying trauma for a very long time. And I'm not coming to you from a particular, very specific lens, but I'm coming to you from the stew that I've created from taking in the research, but also working with human beings and seeing what helps and what doesn't help through a variety of things, and also looking at myself and my own experience, and then working with lots of healthcare and human service providers and frontline workers and police officers who have been traumatized, and working with them through their own recovery as well. So that's the lens through which I share this, and I believe we are still have a lot to learn from trauma. So take that with this today. When I was sharing about overwhelm and overwhelm recovery in the first webinar, what we didn't get to was what happens when you have overwhelm with trauma, because you can have overwhelm and be completely overwhelmed without trauma, and you can have overwhelming experiences and also be traumatized at the same time. So with overwhelm, it really affects your thinking and your planning and your ability to make decisions. And it can be about dealing with too much. I call it too muchness. There's just overload. And there's often this feeling of intense expectations of yourself and intense expectations from others. And overwhelm usually involves helping or caring for other people. So an aspect of that is that there's just a lot of people that you feel responsible for, or a few people that you feel very responsible for, and they can't take responsibility for themselves. So that is kind of a very generic overview lens of some of what we see in overwhelm. With trauma, yes, it'll affect your thinking and your planning and your ability to make decisions, but it is going to deeply affect your emotions. And making decisions immediately after trauma is often way too difficult. And usually we're asking people right after trauma to make a lot of decisions. They've often, if they've lost their homes in the traumatic event, or they've lost people that they love, and we still want them to make all these different decisions. And it's pretty difficult to do that when you're traumatized. I was working with someone this week who lost their spouse. And immediately after, the chaplain working with the person was asking, about all their financial abilities to manage and how they're going to handle things and how they're going to deal with their house payments. And, it was 8 hours after the spouse died. They just could not go to that part of their brain yet. Um, it's important during trauma to make sense of what happened to you and to others around you. And trauma affects your identity. It affects your sense of who am I? Overwhelm does not necessarily affect your identity. It can, but if you have them mixed together, it will. So that's how I distinguish them. And when I'm working with people, I am sorting out, are they traumatized? Are they overwhelmed without trauma or with trauma? Because we're going to end up dealing with how they care for others, all the expectations on themselves, but we're also going to be dealing with a lot of identity issues if we're dealing with trauma. So I like to just sort in my mind where I am with someone when I'm sitting with them. So, trauma also impacts your sense of boundaries. And we talked last time about boundaries. And even if you have a really solid sense of your boundaries and, on average, you see yourself as good with boundaries. When you have a traumatic event, your boundaries are going to somewhat collapse. There's our waterfall coming down. And so it helps to just know that. I teach on the subject of boundaries. I have worked with my own boundaries for a very long time and other people's. And when I go through a lot of stress or a traumatic event, I know that my boundaries are going to weaken. It's like a weakened immune system. My boundaries are going to weaken. And so I pay extra attention to my boundaries. And I'm very careful with asking myself, am I in a place where I can establish a boundary right now? Or will I just sort of collapse and say yes to everything and exhaust myself even further? Or am I in a place where I need to just postpone making any decisions until I feel like my boundaries have recovered and my decision making feels more solid and I'm kind of back on with myself, back online inside? Now, in addition to feeling overwhelmed or traumatized, you can become very depressed and anxious when you're stressed from overwhelm or trauma. And how people respond to this makes a very big difference in recovery from overwhelm. And I have found that many people, particularly people in our field, people who are mental health providers, are a little slower to recognize when they are depressed. But all of us have kind of our own meaning of what we think depressed looks like or what depression means. And those of us who've been working in mental health for a long time, we have seen a wide range of, a continuum of depression and how it affects people. And so I think it's really important to have conversations about depression, but to really ask people what that word means to them. Because sometimes people don't recognize that they're depressed because their idea in their head of what depression looks like is not how it seems to be going for them. And so it's an important conversation to talk about what that word means to people, not necessarily to give them a checklist, but to let them give you a checklist of what they think that means and whether or not they can see signs of that and how stress shows up in them. So, asking people how that is showing up in their body, what they notice is different, so that people are able to develop their own working language for what happens to them when they become stressed and traumatized, and they start to learn what those signs are for them, um, and they develop a language and an ability to recognize when they're depressed. So if I'm working with people now in these times, I realize that, there are many calls that I get when people say that they're depressed, but I still ask them, like, what does that mean for you? And what does that look like? Because when people are traumatized, what I tend to see is that their emotions are out front, like their emotions are running like wild horses out front, and they don't have a sense of feeling emotionally in control. And they feel like they become afraid of their emotions. And so while meeting people right in the middle of trauma, we don't really know, like, do they have a history of depression? Is it even more scary now? Have they been through this before? Have they seen those very normal traumatic symptoms before? Because when you haven't seen them, it's really scary and people think it's never going to go away. And the most helpful thing is to be able to reassure people that these really big emotions that they're experiencing are going to get better, that they aren't always feeling like this, and they are going to get better because they become very afraid of themselves. So that's an important thing to cover with people. And I know many of you are experts at this, so you're thinking of this however you also see this. I love this quote from Danielle Ofri. She's a doctor who wrote the book What Doctors Feel, which is an incredible read and goes really well with looking at the lens of trauma and secondary trauma on us as providers. But she says grief is one of the most commanding of human emotions, and it does not tread lightly. And I think about this pandemic and all of the other things that we're also dealing with climate change and the political trauma in the nation and the racial equity issues that must be fought for at this time, and the global issues that we're dealing with, the economic trauma that many families are experiencing. And I'm looking at all of this and just thinking there is so much grief all around us and weaving all through us. And grief gives us a certain perspective on life, and it needs to be integrated into our life or it overpowers us. And the overpowering of us can turn into more overwhelm and trauma. And if it was a traumatic grief, how we're dealing with it in it, is different than if it was a non-traumatic grief and we're having grief, but we expected the loss, we knew it was coming, we had a little time. When we have a traumatizing grief, we don't have those things. But here's what I want you to know about grief. And if you take only this from today, then take this and carry it as far as you can on the wind. Ignored grief is what puts us at risk for burnout, post-traumatic stress, and secondary trauma. And I would say the highlight in that sentence is ignored grief puts us at risk for burnout. We have this big lie that is shared everywhere that if you do your self-care, you will not get burned out. And I am here to tell you that that is not true. You can do your self-care and still end up getting burned out. But your self-care is what's going to help you recover from your burnout. Your self-care is what is going to carry you through those times. But if we ignore our grief, that is what throws us deep in the well of burnout. And that is really important for us to know, because when you're starting to feel the edges of burnout coming around you, what I really want you to ask yourself is, what is the grief that I am dealing with? What is the loss that I'm feeling? What is the unexplored, not talked about grief that I'm carrying? Because particularly as therapists and mental health workers, and people in healthcare, everything we do is confidential. And so we can end up silently carrying a whole lot of grief that we have been witnessing and that we deeply feel for others. And so we need places to really explore some of our grief and process it, because otherwise it just turns into deep burnout. Years ago, I worked with some hospice workers that had been working in hospice for a very long time, and some of them were really suffering from burnout, which felt very legitimate. They came by really honestly. And they could no longer really do their self-care. They just didn't have the energy, and it was the why bother? There's just going to be yet another death tomorrow. Um, and as we developed a way to really talk about some of those moments that were touching and moving to each of them, and they had a way to really express what they were witnessing in the homes of families and those touching moments with families in a safe place, and then to be able to talk about some of what they saw that gave them grief. That was what they needed. They needed a place where that is obviously part of hospice work. And it used to be in the field of mental health that we did wonderful supervision with everyone. I am somebody who received incredible supervision when I was first coming up in the field. And what I mean by incredible supervision is that I met one-on-one twice a week with a supervisor, and that supervisor asked how I was feeling. And that supervisor had me process looking at my clients through the lens of what I was left with feeling after working with some of these people. And that processing helped me to manage the feelings and to also not be carrying so much extra grief. And I remember when I was cut loose from supervision and, had my own license, I remember that whole first year of really struggling with, wait, where do I let go of this grief? Where do I write it on little pieces of paper, and then do I rip them up and toss them into the water, or do I send them out in prayers? What do I do with it? And so this is something that all of us need a practice for, not just at the beginning of our start in this work, but we need it all the way through our work. And as long as you keep in mind that it is the ignored grief that puts us at risk for burnout, that's what I want you to know. That's what I want you to carry from this. I always look for little poems that really touch me around grief, because it feels like I have a little community then of poets that understand the feelings that I'm carrying. Your absence has gone through me like a thread through a needle. Everything I do is stitched with its color. That's by Merwin. Oh my gosh, I just love that. There are just those moments, when I let go of someone that has passed away in my practice that I may have worked with for a long time, or I watch somebody let go of someone they have loved, and I just think of these 3 lines. Like a thread through a needle, everything is stitched with its color. it just acknowledges the feeling and the loss. Here's another one that I just found like 2 weeks ago. Maybe you're familiar with her, Camille Yamin. Ah, this is so for these times. Okay, I'm going to read it to you. You can close your eyes if you want while I read it to you. She doesn't title her work ever, so it doesn't have a title. What were you doing when the world fell apart, when it separated itself from itself like an orange, when the world transformed back into segments, then chunks, then pieces, parts, then molecules, atoms, then where were you when the world we knew deserted us and said, no, no, I can't hold it together any longer? I'd like you to think about if there's been any time in this past year when you said to yourself, I can't hold it together any longer. No, no, I cannot do this. I can't do this work. Many, many of us have walked back and forth through that passageway of I can't do this any longer or hold it any longer. In this past year, it's been a lot to carry, and you've all been carrying so much. And I've been hearing from therapists, I'm getting older. Maybe I really want to retire right now. Maybe I just want to cut back. And I just say to people, it's been a long year. It's been a year. 1 year has equaled like 5 years this particular year. We've all witnessed a lot and we've all carried a whole lot. I have never carried as much death as I have seen in families as I have been dealing with on average. And I'm not a hospice worker, but I am working with so much death in families right now. And I have all year. And I just, that was just something I dealt with in my practice, but not all of the time. This is all of the time now. And I'm sure that many of you are seeing the same thing. And so I just say to people, we're in extraordinary times. You're doing extraordinary work. And you're really needed, but you're also really needed to take care of you. So even if you give yourself a pass, even if you need to take more time off than you've ever needed in the past, that makes sense. And even if you wonder, like, can I really keep carrying this? What I'd also like you to ask yourself is, who can be your listener? Who can be a support to you? How can you also find ways to express some of the grief that you're carrying? I have started taking watercolor class this year. I am not a painter. I am not a watercolorist, and I am not an artist. I see myself more as a writer. But I have been finding great relief in having painting time and learning to paint and having a way to express some of my grief through painting. So I was working with someone who had their husband die, and I have a tree outside of my house that is a French pussy willow tree. It is my favorite thing. And the pussy willows bloom in February. In the spring, it's full of green leaves, but I cut off a small branch of the pussy willows and brought it in. And as I worked with this person online, I held up the branch of the pussy willow trees. And I just said, the tender softness I really felt with her as she was going through this grief. But then later, I put the pussy willows down on my art table and I just painted them. And it was very meaningful to me. It's just silent movement through the softness, the tenderness that was coming with the grief. And I needed a place to express it. We can't just go from hour to hour right now and not have a way to notice what we're continuing to carry. So, secondary trauma, and are you vulnerable? Well, I'd like to sum this up in 4 simple ways that I look at secondary trauma and whether or not you're vulnerable to secondary trauma. I am very vulnerable to secondary trauma. I've had a lot of experience with secondary trauma, and many years ago, I spent 18 months recovering from secondary trauma. So that was something like 20 years ago or more. Well, I wrote an article about it, so you can read all about that. But during the pandemic, a lot of the secondary trauma returned for me. So I want to talk about it and just share with you what makes us vulnerable to secondary trauma. And you can see whether or not you feel particularly vulnerable, as I know I am. So you're vulnerable to secondary trauma, which is, for those of you that just need a little clarity on that, that is the trauma that we get from witnessing trauma. We're not necessarily in the trauma, but we're witnessing it. Now, of course, in the pandemic, there's been no such thing as being outside the trauma. Everybody has been at different points, or at different points in time, you may have felt more vulnerable and inside of it, actually. But let's just go through secondary trauma. You're vulnerable if you work with trauma, if you are surrounded by it, if you have underlying childhood trauma. So that's if you grew up with a lot of trauma or even a little trauma, some kind of trauma. We can't really measure it as a lot or a little. Trauma is trauma. It's just like you're not a little bit pregnant or a lot pregnant. So if you have underlying childhood trauma, and if you have other traumatic losses. So I was experiencing all of these at the start of the pandemic. And so I felt very vulnerable, and yet I felt very responsible, to my community and to all the people I work with who are also going through the pandemic and having some traumatic losses in their families. And I felt very responsible to people like, wait a minute, I can't be having secondary trauma symptoms right now because, oh my gosh, I need to take care of all these people. Secondary trauma is, it's a real uninvited guest at the moment. It was, and then I realized, given that I am vulnerable to it, I needed to stop and accept that and say, wait, I'm vulnerable to this and I need to take care of myself. I've had secondary trauma in the past and I had a very long recovery. And if I knew how to stop and take care of myself, this is why self-care is so important. And that question that I've asked you to ask yourself, saying, what do I need? If I turn that towards me and say, not only do I offer my presence to other people, but I have to offer presence to myself. And I needed to throw a life ring immediately to myself. And we do know that yoga can help a great deal with trauma and secondary trauma. And so I immediately started doing yoga. I signed up for therapy for myself. And I did a couple of other things, which I wrote about in an article. And if you have noticed that you are vulnerable to secondary trauma, then I really want you to look at what sort of acknowledgement can you do around that and resourcing. At first, people can feel a lot of stigma when they work in the helping professions. There can be this stigma that we're supposed to be resilient, and there's all this focus on resiliency training. And Catherine Painter-Brick, she is a Yale medical anthropologist. She has the best definition of resiliency for me personally. And it's not that resiliency is something that's inside of you, it's that resiliency is something that you harness from your environment, from social factors, from biological factors, from cultural factors, that you harness resiliency. So we keep kind of pulling it towards us, right? And when we do a lot of resiliency training in our field, I prefer that we call it something other than resiliency, because when you go through secondary trauma, you don't feel particularly resilient. And then people feel like it's a stigma and like there's a lot of shame around it because they're supposed to be resilient in the helping profession at all times. And then when they're not, they don't know how to do the resourcing that they need for secondary trauma. And we delay our resourcing. And when we delay getting to our own resourcing or not get to our own resourcing, where we turn everything towards us that we need, well, then we get deeper and deeper down, and our recovery takes much longer. And so, if we can start resourcing quickly and be able to acknowledge and own our own secondary trauma, then we are able to get to the resourcing part of that quicker, and we're able to help ourselves, and we're able to prevent some of the longer term damage that we may feel inside from secondary trauma. I love this picture of this otter. I've seen these otters do this. So there's kelp in the oceans, and otters wrap themselves in the kelp when they sleep so that they don't get pulled away by the waves. And you'll see otters together on the ocean kind of floating like this with the kelp, and they wrap the kelp around each other and tie themselves together like a little community, and they just float on top, but they don't float away. And I feel like that is my image for secondary trauma and for resourcing. It is just reaching for the kelp, and it is tying it around myself and tying it around others in my community with me so that we don't float away. And that's how I want you to think of it. Now, I wrote an article in June. I think somebody is going to pop that in the chat for you. It's on Medium, and it's either June or July. And it was me writing about secondary trauma and just my own personal experience of it. And again, this was a way, I did this writing first for myself. This was a way for me to not have to carry, right? But to allow it to come out and be expressed. And I'm just going to read a little bit of it to you, and then you can get the article and read the rest if you're interested in it. But I did decide to publish it and put it out in the world and share it because there's so much stigma in the helping profession around us always, having to be strong for others and be present and feel good and be resilient, that there might not be times when we feel that way. And so I wanted to acknowledge that in this article. And once I wrote it for myself, I decided to just share it with others. So here's some of that. So you can close your eyes if you want and listen. I can feel some of the shame rise to the surface as I write about this. Secondary trauma is hard to talk about. I recovered from it years ago. I'm a psychotherapist. I'm supposed to have tools, be resilient, and be able to handle feelings, other people's and my own. But secondary trauma snuck up on me. It took me down from behind when I wasn't looking. Secondary trauma is when you get symptoms from witnessing traumatic events. And the first time I got it, I spent years working with abused children, and witnessing the child abuse affected me. So now I look for it and pay attention. During COVID-19, with many people dying, everything shut down, people losing their jobs, and a deadly virus on the loose, I feel the suffering, and the more the suffering expands around me, the more I feel it. As COVID-19 escalated, I felt fear for my family and noticed the fear rising all around me. It was like I was standing in the water waiting for a tsunami to hit. It's hard to tell you. Oh, wait, let me get to this next page. Several of my clients experienced several significant losses, and my clients are people I care about. I grieved with them. I felt the first waves of secondary trauma. It came on with intense weight and pressure bearing down on me. I responded by taking yoga online. Trauma gets lodged in the body. For me, it gets lodged in my neck and hip, and yoga can be an effective support to release trauma from the body. So I started my day every day with yoga, and I'm sticking with it. If I hadn't been through secondary trauma before, I may not have recognized what was happening. The first time I got it was 26 years ago, and I didn't see it coming, and I didn't know I had it until I read a list of symptoms. But after the killing of George Floyd at the hands of police, I felt another wave of secondary trauma come towards me, and this one hit me hard. I keep tearing up at the mention of his killing, uncontrollable tears. I can't stop them. That's another sign of secondary trauma. I'm grateful I had a week off this week. If I didn't, I would have had to call in sick and allow myself to go through the second wave. It's hard to tell you this because I'm a psychotherapist that makes a living helping people with trauma. But I'm writing this to reach out and say, you are not immune to secondary trauma, and neither am I. So there's more in the article, and I do invite you to read the article, and you're welcome to share it if there's any place that you think it can help. I go through and just point out the resources that I used. So I have books, if that will help you. I have deeper online courses. I do have a course on my website, a recorded class that is really about boundaries and trauma, just very specifically those two. So if you need more, feel free to look things up and see what's there. And for a moment now, before I take questions, I just want to offer those of you who need this right now to just put your hands over your heart. Close your eyes. Feel your breath coming into your body. Let yourself know that you are present for you, that you will take care of you today. You will be here for you each day, and that you will make a plan to care for yourself however you need. And I am going to invite Jennifer to come back on and to see if there's a couple of questions or comments or things anybody would like to share.
Siri, thank you for the beautiful webinar. Thank you for your words. I'm going to go ahead and start with a few questions that we have that have come in through the Q&A pod. Rebecca has asked that she would love just some more information about trauma caused by working in the field and then how to continue to practice.
Well, I think you could look up some things online to get more detailed articles about trauma in the field, but Gallup did a really interesting study with healthcare providers, and it showed that we are the worst at taking care of ourselves. So that's kind of very alarming. And in certain fields like child protection work, they're very well aware of how much it traumatizes the workers. And in certain countries, they don't even use their own population anymore to do child protection work. They bring in people from outside country to do that work, and they minimize it for a couple of years. But the turnover rate in the field of doing child protection work is extremely high. And so it really is specific to whatever field you're in. There is some out there for you to find on that. So I encourage you to be specific about your field. But it's also, in some fields, it's kind of silently not spoken about as much as it needs to be. That's really why I like to share on this information with people in our field, because I don't really feel like we spend much time talking about it. And I will tell you honestly, a few years ago when I was doing boundary workshops, healthcare and mental health organizations would say to me, don't call it boundaries and don't call it secondary trauma, call it resiliency training. And I was like, yeah, but I don't actually believe in that. Um, and so there used to be a lot of resistance to my work being titled what I call it. And that's why I loved working with Jennifer and the whole team here at University of Texas, because um, there has been no kind of covering over or dimming down some of what we need to talk about. Um, I think there's also a lot on moral injuries that people have been sustaining in our field during this time. I talked about that in one of the webinars, but you can Google that word as well, because there's some information there that I think is important. There was a second part to that question, Jennifer. What was it?
It was how, again, how to continue to practice. So again, how do we, more information about trauma caused by working in the field, and then how does one, though, continue to practice?
Everybody needs a way to deal with their grief. And everybody needs to be able to practice that daily, like a check-in. And the check-in question that I would like to offer you to use is the one that I use, which is, what do I need? What am I feeling? I use a journal. That's really helpful. So I keep track of myself and I know if I'm starting to slip down. And sometimes it sneaks up on you and you feel yourself pretty teary. And then I say, oh, this is a day where I'm going to take better care of myself, alter my schedule, maybe let go of some plans I made, and maybe do some more walking or whatever I need. So, it's a constant staying in touch. So begin the practice there.
Excellent. Thank you, Sari. I'm going to jump around to some of these questions, but one that I've had a couple that I've asked is, any suggestions for therapists who lost patients through suicide?
Yes. You need your own mourning and grief ritual for that, because you're going through so much in just the shock of that. And you need your own way to say goodbye. You need to make closure. And you also need to have some support to make peace with yourself, that there was nothing you could do to prevent that. And that if a person was going to do that, you probably helped as much as you could, but that there wasn't a way for you to stop that from happening. We don't have magic wands. We have some of our tools, and your support probably kept them alive as long as they could bear it. And so really important for you to have some support around that. I would really encourage you to reach out to another colleague or a therapist that you respect, and talk about this and ask for support, and otherwise hire somebody as a therapist to ask for some support. But you deserve some support, and you also need a way to go and say goodbye to that person and create your own like mini funeral or ritual and time where you allow yourself to say goodbye.
Thank you, Sarah. I actually have two questions. So Juliet and Cindy have asked somewhat similar questions. So what are the symptoms of secondary trauma? Are they the same as overwhelm and primary trauma? And they also say, thanks for this presentation.
Okay. So I would encourage you to Google just a list of symptoms of secondary trauma, and you'll get like clinical list right there, and that will be helpful for you to have. And you'll see like a long list of about 10 things. But I think for each of us, it comes on a little bit differently. And so for me, what I recognize with secondary trauma is I am very teary. And I'll notice that I tear up at like anything really small. It's not just noticing and appreciating and having gratitude, but it's seeing the world in a particular lens. You know how we say like rose-colored glasses? There's what I call my secondary trauma glasses, where I look at the world and everything looks like it's weeping, is my best way of putting it. And I feel this weeping from inside. And for me, it's also recognizing that I don't have any energy. And even if I do my self-care exercises like walking or movement, I feel like my legs are heavy. And that heaviness in my legs is my indicator that it is coming on and that I am in some kind of a trauma trigger. And I just explore that. I explore that with writing. I allow myself to walk slowly. And what I start to do is I just slow everything down and I say, I can't push. I can't do anything fast right now. I just need to go slowly and be with me through this. I also reassure myself that it is going to pass as long as I take really good care of myself in it. And maybe I had, plans on my calendar that involve more high energy activity than what I notice I can produce. So I will cancel and let go of that and say, I just need to kind of curl in with a book right now and just support myself, slowing down. That really helps me. I'll do more meditation, I'll add in extra meditation. So I have a bunch of things that I do when I notice that. But for some people, it depends on when you notice it, because like I said, you could go a long time and not notice you have secondary trauma. And so your symptoms are going to be different. You'll then notice a total lack of interest in any of your activities. You'll notice a lot more isolating and being by yourself. When I was at the worst of it, those 27 years ago, I found myself going into dark places, movie theaters or sweat rooms at the gym. And I would go, so wherever it was dark, and I would just sit and cry. So that doesn't happen to me now when it starts to approach me, because like I get right on it. So the symptom severity that you could experience is going to be different depending on where you are in it. I hope that helps, because I don't like people to wait until they're in the most severe to recognize it. It's like I want you to get it when you start to get a taste of it on your mouth. And then to say, okay, I'm going to start doing lots of resourcing and extra support to myself. And really, if you have witnessed trauma and you're surrounded by it and you've had it in your childhood, or you've had some past traumatic event, you're vulnerable. It's like if you've broken your arm before and that area in your arm is a little more vulnerable to being broken again where the bone healed. It's not quite as strong as it was. That's it.